fish on.
Have you got the right line?
In this video we'll go through the basics of the fly line. What we will do is try to understand what's going on under the water and to help you fish better and choose the right line for the method. In a lot of the videos you will see that I'm mending my line quite a lot, and I've often been asked as to why I'm mending the line. Why don't you just put a sinking line on, end of? Problem: I can't present the pattern as I want. But if we watch these clips, and hopefully you will get better understanding and certainly understand why I fish what I fish.
Okay, so we'll start with the sink lines. And what we'll do for an example is start with the die 5 and then introduce the die 2, and this will give you the two extremes. Now, you don't have any real control over the sink line, but the only control that you will have is to slow its descent, and that'll only be by a small amount, and that will be with the retrieve. But as you're incorporating a faster retrieve, that'll obviously slow it a little bit more. Okay, so you can see that the die 5, it drops through the columns quite quickly. Obviously once it hits the bottom, good methods to fish this off this line will be things like the fab, the booby, you can fish lures, but any pattern that you want to fish that's tight to the bottom. Okay, so now we're going to do the die 2. Now die 2 obviously is dropping down through the columns a lot slower, but what we're also going to do, we're going to put in a zone. Now the zones, I've no idea as to what size the zone is, and anybody watching the zone is, they're normally referring to where the fish are feeding at. Now, if they say it's 6 foot, does that mean it's 6 to 8 foot, 6 to 4 foot, or could it mean 6 foot meaning it's 4 foot to 8 foot? But I've no idea. But let's just say it's 6 foot. So I'm going to put in a line represents the zone, which is going to be 4 foot down and down to 8 foot. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to put both lines in together. I'm going to use a slow or a steady retrieve. But it's pretty obvious what's going to happen here is that the die 5 is going to drop through that zone pretty quickly, whereas the die 2 will remain in that zone for a lot longer, which means you're going to get a better chance of being picked up by the fish. One other thing to consider is the length of the cast. If you've got a big cast, that means the line's in water for a lot longer, and the longer it's in the water, the more it's going to drop. So the only way to keep the die 5 in that zone for any prolonged period is to speed the retrieve up. So when would I fish a die 2? More often than not, it's when the fish are moving a lot quicker. As we already know, a faster retrieve will maintain a certain level. So I can do anything now from a steady retrieve up to quite a quick retrieve. And the patterns I'll use more often than not are going to be unweighted. The difference here now is that these patterns, due to them being unweighted, is that they're going to fish totally different to a weighted pattern. Obviously, as I'm fishing these, they're going to be more parallel and more fish-like going through the water. Whereas as soon as I put a weighted fly on, then obviously they're going to be creating more of a porpoise coming through the water. So it's entirely up to yourselves as to what you're looking for. But normally when I'm fishing them quicker, I'll go with unweighted. Not that it'll make any real difference to you when you're fishing, but the sink lines, or for most of the sink lines, will sink slower in the winter as opposed to the summer.
Okay, so I hope you get a bit of an idea with the sink lines. Die 2, if I do want to fish tight on the bottom, obviously I'm going to wait. It's either that or I buy myself, go out and buy a die 5, but I know I'm only going to use that once in a blue moon. I'm going to get more use out of the die 2. Fish that quite comfortably for a lot longer than say die 3, die 4, die 5. Well, the quicker the line's going through that columns, the less time you're going to spend in a zone. And it doesn't matter where that zone is. If you're more competitive fishing, you're going to need a lot more lines, because being more competitive fishing, that means you've got to get into the fish as quick as you can. You're going to cover everything. So it's all about getting contact that fish as quick as you can, because it's all about numbers. It's about catching as many fish as you can to win the competition or whatever that you're in. Get on it and get the fish out. I'm getting carried away here, so what we'll do, we go through the floating lines as best I can. As I say, there are lots of options with the floating lines as regards with the sink tip. As I'm going through, I might hit on them a bit, but let's just crack on, have a go.
The floating line is probably the biggest selling line all over the world. And why? It's because it's so versatile. You've got almost total control with this line, and it'll cover possibly 70% of your fishing. Now, it'll take forever to go through everything that we could do with the floating fly line, but what we'll work mainly on, I think, will be keeping your pattern in that zone. Okay, let's start with the flat calm conditions. Let's say we're going to present the fly at, say, 6 foot. Okay, ignore the black fly line on the water, that's something for later. But what we'll do, we'll put what looks like a sunray line on the water, and we'll put a 6 foot tippet into the water. And the first thing you're noticing is the angle of the tippet. Underneath the water surface is that there's always going to be movement. Now, if we want to present that fly at 6 foot, because of the movement in the water, what we'd normally do, I'll probably add a good foot or two to make sure we're hitting that 6 foot mark. Okay, so now the wind's picking up, and what you can see obviously is the wind's picking the fly line up, and what that's doing to the fly is obviously it's pulling it up towards the surface and it's starting to move it a lot quicker. Other thing that's happening is now we've got undertow. Undertow always works in the opposite direction to the wind, and to give you a rough idea, whatever speed the wind is, generally the undertow is going to be about the same. So if we have a quick look at where the position of our fly and our tippet was in calm, and then switch that to what it is with just the effect of the wind, and now we'll just add the effect of the undertow as well. Okay, so with that wind drag on the line and introduction of the undertow, it's obviously pulling our pattern way off the 6 foot mark. It will continue to climb as we incorporate a retrieve, and as the retrieve speeds up, the higher the pattern gets. So there are a number of things that we can do to maintain the depth, and that is things like sink tips, leaders, or even the weighted fly. Now, the main reason why I would be fishing a sink tip as opposed to the die 2 is with the die 2, obviously I want to maintain a certain depth at a certain speed, whereas now I'm wanting to fish the pattern a lot slower, and if I was on the die 2 it would continue sinking. So now I can control its depth, but I can also fish it from dead slow to pretty quick. But as I speed the retrieve up, the pattern is now starting to rise above the zone, so now I have to consider a faster sink tip. So selecting the right tip or leader isn't just about the depth, it's as much about the pace that you're going to fish the pattern at. So obviously the faster the pace you're going to retrieve, the faster the sink you need. So for the next one, it's the effect of wind on our line and what is it really doing. So as the wind picks your line up, it affects the area with least resistance, and that's your fly. And as the wind picks up, the higher your fly climbs and the faster it'll move. And the other thing to consider, as I've mentioned before, it's called undertow, and this is a current that goes in the opposite direction of the wind, and this is going to affect your presentation also. So one way around this one is to simply mend the line. Now when I make an initial cast, obviously the wind, if you're going in a stronger wind, is going to pull your line during the cast downwind, and you need to make an initial mend. And once you've done that, all it takes is a few smaller mends during the drift. So all you're doing when you make a mend is reducing the amount of line drag, and that allows the fly to go down again. Another way is to cast along an angle to the wind. So again, there's less wind resistance on the line, and that will allow the fly to get down a little bit more. However, if you do need to get any more depth from it, you're still going to have to make a small mend in the line. Okay, so the wind can be a bit of a hindrance at times, but for a lot of us, it's a benefit. For one, it'll disguise our cast as it hits the water. But for myself, the real benefits is that I can cast it in here and fish it around to here, unlike the sink line, which is just one direction, straight in. So this method is perfect for introducing a lot of different patterns. A popular method here is with the indicator, but for me it's straight off the floating braid and put whatever tippet length I want, normally fished with a single fly, so I'm not overweighting the floating braid, and that'll mean that I can fish it all the way through at whatever level I want.
Thought I could hear a fish splashing.
Okay, so what I've got here now is an example for a subscriber. It's Forever Red. So what I've been asked is, I've seen a guy using a floating line with a 10-foot leader for an 8-foot deep lake. Surely it'll do the same job as a fast glass or a sinker, as line will be sitting on the bottom. Okay, so we'll start with the sink line first. That's the one that's so easy, straightforward. Obviously put the cast out, let it go down, and all you're going to do then is retrieve it in. Now we're 8-foot lake, so it ain't going to be too long before you're hitting flat bottom. Okay, so we're on the floating line. Forever Red has already mentioned that the guy was on a 10-foot tippet or leader, so being that it's an 8-foot lake, he's obviously allowed for any movement underneath the surface. That would be fine for a slow retrieve. You're not going to be far off on a slow retrieve. But as soon as you pick that retrieve up, then obviously that's going to come a lot higher in the water columns, and that's even with a weighted fly or lure on the end. But if I had to choose a method between these two, I would most definitely be fishing the floating line. And the reason for that, even if the fish were sat tight on the bottom, that pattern, that bit higher up, is a lot easier spotted than a pattern coming across on the bottom.
Okay, well that video has seriously just done my head in. When I was first asked about it, I thought, yeah, okay, that's fine, that's going to be easy. It's just talking about fly lines and how they're working and just go through all of this. And I thought this is going to be easy. I didn't think it would take too long, but honestly, the more I got into it, the more I realised I was just lost with it. There's so many scenarios. For instance, when we go out, you know, depending on what you're going to use will depend a lot on how where the fish are in the water, what level they're at, how fast they're moving. It depends a lot on the conditions, the wind. There's so many things as to why you would use one line and not the other. It was just more than I even thought. And to be honest with you, when I was putting it all, slowly building it up and putting it together, and then I realised this video is going to be massively long, and I had to start chopping away, cutting it and trying. So I'm just hoping that I've got it about right. I don't know. And even now when I sit there and going through it and I think perhaps I should add this in, add that, and I'm starting to build it. I've just had to put it to bed, leave it alone, because otherwise I'm just going to keep going again. But I really hope that there's something in there that you can get from it. One thing to point out is obviously is when I'm doing the floating line and you see that I'm mending the line all the time. Now there's a lot of times when you won't want to mend the line. There's a lot of times when I first put that line out and I'm letting it come around in the wind. Obviously it's fishing it a bit higher and a bit faster. Times when that method, just letting it come around in the wind, is going to attract the fish. But if I'm not getting picked up by the fish by then obviously then I start mending so I can slow it up and get it a bit deeper. But it's just a method of how you can get around the issue with the wind picking the line up. But at the same time, I'm not fishing in water that's much over 20-25 foot. Once I start getting into waters that are going to be a lot deeper, more regular fishing in them, then obviously I may end up picking a faster line, but for the moment I'm happy with the die 2. And there's that transition between the floater and the die 2 where sometimes the die 2 can cover a lot of what the floater does and sometimes the floater can cover what the die 2 does. But beyond that, then the die 2 really comes into its own. I was only out in the water there last week with the die 2. I was going through the water and I had a small size 14 nymph on the end, putting that out on the water, and pretty quick. As soon as it hit the water I was stripping in and I was picking some good fish up. I did get snapped once, mate, because the fish came up and it hit me so aggressively. You couldn't have done nothing about it. But I'm sure there's going to be a lot of different things that I haven't covered. I know that from when I've gone through it. But as I say, I hope it's going to be useful. And maybe I can cover something on the likes of sink tips and leaders and braids and things like that in a different video. But I know there's a lot of you out there that are going to look at that and think, well, I know all of this. But there's a lot of people out there that aren't aware of a lot of these things, and I just hope it's very useful for you. And more importantly, that when you start looking at lines in the respect of it's more about how fast the retrieve is as opposed to how deep it is. But if you have enjoyed the video and you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing. It'd be nice to see the channel just grow a little bit more. Gives me a bit more confidence, a bit more. Don't forget, hit the bell for future notification, because we got some good things planned coming up. Give us a thumbs up and it'd be great to hear from you. So please comment. So until the next video, take care.